They only hired her to cook. Just hot biscuits, gravy, and a clean floor. That's all she promised when she stepped off the wagon in a faded gray dress and a face lined by more sorrow than sleep. Clara Jennings didn't come looking for love, not anymore. At 51, she had buried one husband and three dreams. All she wanted was a roof over her head, a stove to tend, and a reason to wake up before the sun. But this family, this wild, half-broken bunch with six muddy boots by the door, and a father who hadn't smiled in 2 years. They needed more than just warm meals. They needed a mother. And though Clara never said it out loud, she needed a family just as much. But just when the porch began to feel like home, when the youngest child finally reached for her hand, and the man of the house started lingering by the firelight, after supper a letter arrived, from a woman he once loved. And Clara, who had learned to live without asking now, had to ask the hardest question of her life. If she had only been a placeholder for someone else's heart, could she bear to lose it all again? You ever feel like life starts again when you thought it was long over? This story is for the ones who still stir soup alone, but hope someone will sit at the table. It's for the quiet hearts who give everything and still wonder if they're enough. Because sometimes what looks like a job becomes a calling, and what starts as cooking dinner becomes building a home. Will he choose Clara? Will the children still call her Ma? And what did that letter say? Stay with us. The next chapter may just remind you that the best kind of love often comes last and lasts the longest. The train pulled into Dalton Hollow at dusk, the last sun pouring amber light across the quiet wooden platform. No one noticed the woman who stepped down from the third car, her black skirt brushing her ankles, her gloved hands clutching a patched satchel. Her name was Clara Winslow, and she had nowhere else to go. 50 years old and recently widowed Clara had spent the last 2 decades cooking in boarding houses, logging camps, and one sorrowful marriage that taught her how to make biscuits soft, but never made her feel safe. Her husband had been cruel, not with fists, but with words, silence, and eyes that wandered past her. When he died from a burst gut, she wept, but only because she had no idea what came next. Now she stood on a platform where no one was waiting, clutching a letter in her pocket. It was from a man named Ephraim Kittredge, a widower with 6 children on a ranch that desperately needed a cook. The letter had been brief. My children need feeding. Their mother's been gone a year. If you're able, come by rail. You'll earn your keep. It ain't soft work. Clara had read the letter 3 times by lamplight before packing everything she owned into one bag and leaving the town that never once called her neighbor. The Kittredge Ranch sat 12 miles out. No buggy came to fetch her. She walked. By the time Clara crested the final hill and saw the sagging barn and smoke curling from the house, chimney night had draped the valley in stillness. Her shoes were soaked from the creek she'd forded. Her back ached, but she squared her shoulders and stepped into the yard. A boy no older than 10 came out, first shirt, 2 big cheeks smudged with ash. He stared. Then another, then 2 girls. They formed a half moon around her, silent. Finally, a tall man with worn hands and eyes that had clearly known hard years appeared in the doorway. He didn't smile. You, Clara. She nodded. You cook? Yes. Then come in. That was all. No welcome, no handshake. Just need. Inside, the stove was cold and the children quiet with hunger. Clara set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. She boiled oats, fried salt, pork, cut apples for a pie. By the time the clock chimed 9, the house smelled like something soft and remembered. The children ate with wide eyes. Ephraim didn't say much, but he finished everything on his plate. When the youngest little Sadie tugged Clara's apron and whispered, "You cook like Mama," Clara turned away so no one could see the tears rise. She wasn't their mother. She wasn't even truly welcome. But for the first time in years, she wasn't invisible either. And that night when she lay on the cot in the coal room behind the kitchen, Clara stared at the ceiling and whispered to herself, "You're still here. That's something." The table had been empty for so long. But what happens when a warm meal starts to fill more than just bellies? Clara rose before dawn, her joints stiff from the cot in the prairie chill. She built the fire with practiced hands, poured water into the kettle, and set about mixing flour with lard for biscuits. The kitchen, once silent and cold, began to breathe. One by one, the children wandered in, still in nightshirts, their hair mussed with sleep. None spoke at first, just watched her with cautious eyes. She made room for them. She placed an extra chair by the stove for Sadie to warm her toes, handed the oldest Nora a brush for her sister's tangled hair, gave each of them something to do, not because she needed the help, but because she knew what it felt like to be useful. At exactly 7, Ephraim Kittredge walked in, boots heavy on the pine floor. His hat in hand, he paused a moment longer than he had the night before. Something about the smell of hot biscuits and the sight of his children, combed and seated, seemed to soften the crease in his brow. "You've done a lot for one night," he said. Clara didn't look up from stirring the gravy. They were hungry. He cleared his throat. "You sleep all right?" She nodded. It was quiet. The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was careful. Two people who had lived too long among ghosts, unsure how to speak in the presence of the living. After breakfast, Ephraim disappeared outside with the boys. Clara washed dishes with Nora, who barely reached the sink. The girl's hands were red from scrubbing her fingers raw. "You do this every day?" Clara asked gently. "Since Mama passed," Nora whispered. "Pa says we've all got to carry our weight." Clara dried a plate and placed a soft hand on the girl's shoulder. "Even strong horses get tired." Nora didn't reply, but she leaned into Clara's side just a little, just enough. That afternoon, while the children played in the pasture, Clara swept the parlor. She found a broken music box on the shelf. Winding it revealed only silence, but she dusted it anyway. Some things deserved gentleness, even if they were no longer whole. Ephraim walked in as she was straightening the bookshelf. "You don't need to do all this," he said. "I know," Clara replied, her voice even. "But I want to." He studied her for a long moment. Then almost awkwardly he said, "The last woman who cooked here was my wife. She didn't talk much either, but she smiled when the house was clean." Clara didn't speak. She simply smiled, and it wasn't the practiced smile of someone earning her keep. It was the smile of someone who understood that silence could be sacred, that the act of staying could speak louder than words. That night, while the children slept and the fire hummed in the stove, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table. Ephraim came in quietly, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat across from her. They didn't talk, but they didn't have to. The second chair at the table, long unused, now held someone who didn't need permission to belong. The warmth of a kitchen can do more than chase off cold. It can thaw hearts long frozen. But when quiet comfort begins to stir something deeper, will it be welcomed or feared? Winter came early that year, pressing down hard on the Kittredge ranch with wind sharp enough to slice through wool. Clara sewed by lantern light, hemming sleeves too short for fast-growing boys, patching pants that had seen too many knees fall in the dust. The children had begun calling her Miss Clara with the kind of ease that felt dangerous. Like the name had always belonged to her, like she'd always been there. But Clara knew better. She knew how quickly comfort could vanish, how warmth could be mistaken for permanence, and how even the kindest smiles could twist when fear entered the room. It started with a letter. Ephraim found it in town, hand-delivered by a cousin of his late wife, a woman from Missouri who claimed kinship and hinted at a better upbringing for the children. The letter, full of polite scorn, suggested Clara's presence might be confusing, even harmful for impressionable young minds. Ephraim didn't show Clara the letter right away. He kept it in a drawer for 2 days. But silence has a way of thickening in a house like smoke from a smoldering log. On the third night, she noticed the change. He wouldn't meet her eyes during supper. The children asked if she'd braid their hair like Mama used to, and Ephraim answered for her, "Not tonight." Clara didn't ask questions. She'd learned long ago that pressing a man too early was like pushing against a fence post, not yet set. It leans away before it finds its root. But that night, after the house went still, she stepped outside into the snow. The sky was endless above her, black as ink. She held her hands to her chest, remembering the last time she let herself settle into something soft, and how quickly it had burned. Her first husband had been gentle until he wasn't, until the day she found her handmade quilt stitched from scraps of her mother's dresses, half buried in ash behind their cabin. "Too bright," he'd told her. "Too much softness makes men weak." And now, years later, standing under the same stars, she felt the chill of that old betrayal rising again. Inside, Ephraim stood at the window watching her. He remembered the letter, the suggestions that perhaps Clara was too soft, too strange, too much like a shadow of what once was. But he also remembered something else. The way the children laughed again. The way the house smelled like bread and fresh wood soap. The way Nora had clung to Clara's skirts that morning after a bad dream, whispering, "Don't go." He stepped outside, boots crunching snow. Clara didn't turn. "You feel it too," she said softly. "That fear." Ephraim stood beside her. "I do." Clara lowered her eyes. "You're not sure if you can ask me to stay, or if you want me to go. I'm not proud of that." Silence stretched between them, not cruel but honest. "I won't beg," she whispered. "Not again." He nodded. "I know." They stood in the cold until their breath turned to fog, until the house behind them no longer felt like refuge, but a question unanswered. When belonging starts to feel real, fear often knocks first. Will Clara be pushed away like before? Or will someone finally fight for her to stay? Clara didn't leave. Not that night and not the next morning, when Ephraim still seemed wrapped in some invisible thread, pulled tight between loyalty to ghosts and the undeniable rhythm of a new life forming around him. Instead, she did what she'd always done when the world felt uncertain. She cooked. It started with a fresh loaf of sourdough, the kind that took patience. She shaped it slow, let it rise by the stove overnight, and baked it just before the children woke. The smell wandered through the house like forgiveness, warm, slow, and familiar. The children came running, tousled and half-dreaming, cheeks pink from the chill. Clara poured buttermilk into tin cups, sliced thick slabs of bread, and handed them out like blessings. And when Nora climbed into her lap, sticky with honey, Ephraim didn't say a word. But he saw it. He saw something he hadn't dared want again, a home not defined by memory or duty, but one that pulsed with something alive and still choosing him. That afternoon, Clara took the letter from the drawer where Ephraim had hidden it and placed it in the fire. "I've been erased," before she said softly, standing beside the hearth, her eyes on the curling edges of the paper. "This time I choose not to let it happen quietly." He didn't stop her. That evening, Ephraim found her on the back porch, darning socks by lamplight. The sky was lavender and the wind had stilled. "I never asked if you wanted to stay," he said. "No," she answered, threading her needle. "You didn't." He swallowed. "Do you?" Clara paused. Her fingers rested on the heel of a worn sock, the yarn frayed with use. "Wanting's not the same as being allowed to." "You're allowed." She looked up, then slowly, her eyes steady. "You sure?" He nodded once. "Not because of the cooking or the sewing or what the kids need. Because of you. Because you stayed even when you didn't know if I'd ask." The silence that followed was not awkward, but reverent. A kind of healing that doesn't announce itself loudly, like the hush after snowfall. Like a woman who chooses her place not by permission, but by presence. "I won't go," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But don't expect me to be small." "I never wanted small," he said. "I just didn't know something could be this strong and still be kind." Inside, the children laughed over something spilled, and the smell of stew clung to the walls like memory. And just outside the door, under a sky darkening with stars, Clara and Ephraim sat together, quietly changing the shape of each other's lives. When a woman stops waiting to be chosen and begins to choose herself, the world shifts. "Will love follow the courage?" she's finally claimed. It was a Tuesday, crisp and golden, when the envelope arrived, creased, dust-specked, and addressed not to Clara, but to Ephraim Calloway in a looping hand she didn't recognize. She didn't mean to open it, but the way it sat on the windowsill all morning, catching light like it was made to be noticed, made something twist in her chest. So when Ephraim and the children rode out to tend fence posts past the southern field, Clara stood in the kitchen, flour-dusted and alone, and finally picked it up. Her fingers hesitated. Then the seal gave way with a sigh. The letter was from a woman named Isabelle, writing from Kansas City. "I heard from someone passing through that you're still on that old land, still raising those children. I won't pretend I didn't run, Ephraim. I did, and maybe I'll always be running. But if there's still a place for me, if Nora still calls me Mama in her sleep, then I could come home." Clara sat down slowly. It felt like the air had thinned. She wasn't a woman prone to dramatics, not anymore. Life had pressed that out of her, left behind something quieter. But even the quiet breaks sometimes. She read it again and again, tracing the place where Isabel's ink blotched like a regret too thick to finish writing. Clara folded the letter, her hands steady, though her stomach churned. When Ephraim returned, she handed it to him without a word. He read it standing by the door, shoulders hunched, jaw tight. When he looked up, his face was unreadable. "Did you know she might write I didn't?" he said simply. "She left." "I know. She might come back." He looked at her for a long, long time, then finally said she might try. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She lay awake in the loft listening to the soft breaths of the children, the creak of the house, the wind whispering things through the eaves. And below, Ephraim sat alone by the dying fire, the letter still in his lap. In the morning he didn't mention it, but neither did she. And in that space between silence and speaking, a distance began to grow, not loud or angry, but like frost between fence rails. Slow. Inevitable. The children didn't notice. They still clung to her apron and braided her graying hair. But Clara felt it, in the way Ephraim stood at the doorway longer than usual before coming in the way he looked past her when she spoke as if measuring someone else's voice behind hers. She was not a jealous woman, but she had been second before, left before, passed over before, and her bones remembered how cold that could get. Clara had lived long enough to know some ghosts never rattled chains or whispered names. Some just sat at your dinner table without speaking. The letter from Isabelle was one such ghost. She didn't come, not that week, not the next, but her shadow did. It followed Ephraim like a slow echo, making him quieter, making Clara smaller in rooms she used to feel at home in. And yet the children, God bless the children, remained unchanged. Nora, with her gap-toothed smile, still begged for bedtime songs. Milo still asked Clara to patch his socks even when they didn't need patching. They didn't seem to remember the woman who had left, only the one who had stayed. Still, Clara felt the shift. The distance between her and Ephraim, once subtle, now pressed like boards warped by rain. He grew thoughtful, hesitant. Sometimes he'd reach for her hand and stop halfway. Once he even apologized when she served stew instead of roast, though she hadn't asked for apologies. Then came the storm. Not the kind with lightning and thunder, but the kind that breaks quietly. She found Ephraim outside the barn one night, sitting on an overturned feed bucket, his hat at his feet, staring at nothing. His shoulders looked too old for his frame. "I'm sorry," he said before she could ask. "For what?" "For bringing you here, for letting you settle into a life that might not stay yours." Clara crossed her arms, not from anger, but to hold herself still. "I didn't come to be owed. I came because I chose to. But I didn't choose you the way a man should," he murmured. "I was afraid, and you were convenient." Her voice was steady. "No." "Good." He looked up, then eyes rimmed red. "Too good. And I didn't think I deserved something that stayed." Clara's breath caught. She sat beside him on the bucket, their knees brushing. The barn light flickered behind them, like a memory deciding whether to stay. "You think I haven't been left before," she said quietly. "I've been picked second. Picked never. Called too much, too plain, too heavy for someone's arm. But I didn't shrink. And I'm not about to now." Ephraim turned to her. "I don't want to hurt you." Clara looked straight at him. "Then don't." The wind rustled the trees behind the barn. A horse shifted in its stall. And for a moment something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but a truth laid bare, and met with gentleness. "Isabelle might come," Ephraim said finally. "She might try to claim a piece of this." Clara nodded. "But she can't claim me, and she can't unraise your children, or unlove the way I've learned to love this place." He exhaled and his shoulders sagged, not in defeat but release. "She was the storm," Clara whispered. "But I stayed through the quiet." It was Nora who broke the silence. "Miss Clara," she whispered one morning, tugging at the hem of Clara's apron, while the sun was still brushing gold across the windows. "Are you going to stay forever?" Clara bent down and cupped the child's cheek. "Forever's a long time, sweetheart. But we want you to," Milo piped in, coming in from the barn with straw in his hair. "Papa wants you to too, even if he's slow to say it." Clara smiled, though something in her chest trembled, like a thread pulling free. She had stayed through storms of every kind of grief, of guilt, of doubt, but she had never stayed where she was wanted. Not truly. That afternoon, Ephraim built a new table. He worked without saying much, but Clara saw the care in each sanded edge, the polish rubbed in with slow, reverent hands. The old one had always been too small for all of them. This one had 8 chairs, not 7. That night, after the stew was cleared and the lanterns lit low, Ephraim reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. It came yesterday, he said. Clara took it, her fingers steady despite the racing of her heart. The handwriting was Isabelle's, sharp and elegant. She read it quietly, then folded it again and handed it back. She's not coming, Clara said simply. She married a merchant in Kansas, sent a blessing and a photograph of her boys. Ephraim nodded slowly. I thought I'd feel something. Relief, maybe. Regret. And what do you feel? He reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. Grateful. That you stayed. That you never asked me to be anything but kind. That you let the children love you without fear of losing you again. She squeezed his hand gently. And what about you, Ephraim? Did you ever love me or just the way I cared for what was yours? He looked at her then, not just with eyes, but with a soul laid bare. I love the way you stir soup and hum low, he said. I love how you don't flinch when something breaks. I love that you came without asking for anything and gave everything. I love you, Clara. Her breath caught as if the room had shifted slightly like a new root breaking earth. Then she smiled. Well, she said softly, it's about time. The children burst into applause from the doorway, having crept in without a sound. Nora was grinning. Milo whooped like a cowboy. Even little Susie clapped her hands, though she didn't know why. The table was set for 8 now, and as Clara looked around at the laughter, the warmth, the man beside her, whose eyes no longer held ghosts, she realized this was what forever looked like. Not fireworks, but soup that stayed warm, hands that reached across a table, and someone choosing you not once but every day after. If this story touched something in you, dear friend, you're not alone. We all long to be chosen, not just for what we give, but for who we are. If you know someone who's waited too long to be seen, maybe this is the story to share. Subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, for more tales that whisper hope across dry land. Leave a comment. Would you like to see what happens next in Clara's journey? Or hear stories of others like her, quietly brave and deeply kind? Your words help this little campfire stay lit. What if love, real love, comes not in a rush, but in a quiet room where someone finally says you're home? Sometimes what we think is the end of our story is just a soft place where a new one begins. Clara Jennings didn't come to the ranch expecting love. She didn't expect small arms to wrap around her waist or a man's quiet eyes to find steadiness in hers. But as it turned out, what the ranch needed wasn't just a cook. It needed a woman who knew how to hold broken things gently. And Clara, after all the loss she'd endured, knew how to love without asking anything in return. But this time, someone loved her back. And that's what made all the difference. You see, healing often shows up in small, ordinary moments. A meal served warm, a porch light left on, a name spoken with tenderness. And maybe that's something we can carry into our own lives. That no matter our age or what we've lost, it's never too late to be needed, to be seen, to be chosen. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. Share it with someone who still believes in late-blooming love. And before you go, would you like to see what happens next for Clara and the children? Or hear more stories like this? Leave us a comment below. Your words help this little corner of the West stay warm for others. From our hearth to yours, thank you for being here.